Welcome to the Data Science Institute's virtual seminar series. My name is Dr. Sarah Mackey from Lawrence Livermore National Laboratory. Here at Lawrence Livermore, data science has become an essential discipline in many of our key program areas. LLNL is home to many challenging datasets, as well as home to some of the world's most advanced supercomputers. Our data science staff work in a variety of areas, including machine learning, artificial intelligence, big data analytics, statistical inference, predictive modeling, and uncertainty quantification. The Data Science Institute acts as a central hub for our lab's data science activities. We host events like this seminar series in order to introduce new ideas and potential collaborations to our laboratory staff. We invite speakers from outside the laboratory, from the Bay Area and beyond, to share their innovative approaches with our data science community. We're pleased now to include a wider audience in our seminar series through these recordings. You can read about past speakers at our website at data-science.llnl.gov, or you can email us at datascience@llnl.gov. Thank you and enjoy the seminar series.
I'm very excited to welcome Dr. Emilie Purvine. Emilie is a senior data scientist at Pacific Northwestern National Laboratory. And although her academic background is in pure mathematics with a bachelor's of science from Wisconsin-Madison and a PhD from Rutgers, her research since joining PNNL in 2011 has focused on applications of combinatorics and computational topology, together with the theoretical advances that are needed in order to support those applications. At PNNL, Emilie has been both a PI and technical staff on projects and applications ranging from computational chemistry and biology to cybersecurity and power grid modeling. So quite the array of applications that Emilie has worked on. Emilie, thank you for joining us today. And when you are ready, you can go ahead and begin your talk.
All right. Well, thank you, Sarah, for the invitation and the introduction. I'm excited to share my recent work with you all. And I should mention that this is not just my work. Just on these slides alone, I've got three wonderful collaborators here at PNNL: Sinan Aksoy, Cliff Jocelyn, and Brenda Pregastis. And along with them, we have a very large team. Over the years, we've been working on this area of computational topology and hypergraphs for many years. We don't collaborate with all of these people all the time, but they've all had a hand in this work one way or the other. And so definitely wanted to acknowledge all of these folks. And if you're interested in working with us on this area, after you hear what our work is about, please don't hesitate to reach out. So I'm going to start with the motivation for this work. And the motivation here is that data is collected from complex systems, but studied with fairly simplified models. So for example, in biology, the central dogma of biology is that DNA is transcribed into RNA, which is transcribed into mRNA, and then into proteins. And that's a fairly simple set of things that you could model, or in a metabolic pathway, you have, for example, the Krebs cycle. You can collect data about all of the different pieces and parts that put together the Krebs cycle. But the reality is that this metabolic pathway is just one in a giant sea of metabolic pathways that are all interacting in complex ways. And so we can't just think about the data in the context of the one thing we want to study. It's part of this larger complex system. Another example is in physics. We model things typically, with frictionless ramps and spheres and vacuums and perfectly shaped wedges and those kinds of things. But of course, the reality is that we have a lot of complicated forces at work: spin and drag and air resistance and all those things. We've got subatomic particles that have their own rules and regulations. And so, it's not just as simple as just collecting the data and looking at the simplified model. And the last example is in cyber communications, where we can put together a pretty good map of our cyber network, saying, you know, what's connected to where and who can talk to who. But in reality, again, the data gets really messy. It can get very complex. This is an example of a cyber system, just a small snapshot, I think less than an hour's worth of data and all the communications that happen within that. So again, motivation here of complex systems studied using simplified models. So our focus in this talk and in my work is on relational type data, in which you have objects and then relationships between or among those objects, commonly modeled with a graph or a network. One example would be a publication database, so PubMed, MathSciNet, DBLP, all of these kinds of publication databases. You could model this by saying that the objects are authors, like in this picture here in the upper right, and the relationships are collaborations, so a pairwise collaboration is indicated by an edge between a pair of authors. And you could use this graph then to study how authors might cluster based on the discipline, which is the colors in this picture on the right, or how some authors might be bridges between different disciplines or different groups, and many other things you can use to this graph to study. Another example is protein interactions. So for example, the string database. In this case, the objects are proteins and the relationships are interactions between proteins either known or predicted or found via co-expression. Text mining, they look for that in the string database, and then protein homology, so across species. You can use this graph then to study how proteins interact, how they cluster based on different functions, and how they're more or less important in various systems. So this is an example of I just searched for this one protein and found all of its things that it kind of interacts with in the database. But pairwise often, or sometimes, I guess I should say, isn't enough. It's not enough to just model the pairwise relationships. Co-authorship is much more than just pairs of people talking and collaborating. It's groups of people collaborating, right? We don't just have pairwise papers. We have group-wise papers. Friendship and following relationships on social media can be modeled, of course, with a graph, but social groups need something more than pairwise. Protein interactions, another one. Yes, they interact pairwise, but they also interact in complex ways with groups of proteins. And so when pairwise isn't enough, we need something more. We need a hypergraph, which I will define in a few slides. Just wanted to say that PNNL has been working in computational topology and hypergraph analytics now for a number of years, probably 5 to 8 years in this area, and we've developed a number of things in the mathematics and methodology. The things that are highlighted in orange are things that I'll mention some point during this talk. We have a couple of software libraries. I'll give you more information on HyperNetX later. We've also got one in the Chapel language. And we've been using hypergraphs in a number of different applications. I will mention DNS and computational virology later, but we've worked in a few other areas as well. We are not alone. PNNL is not alone in this. There's a big movement in network science to move towards hypergraphs, both from the computational topology side and the network science side, to look at hypergraphs, simplicial complexes, and other related objects. And so we are excited to be part of this community as it moves forward. So the next thing I will jump into defining hypergraphs. So what we think is an answer to modeling complexity in relational data, or at least towards an answer. We'll get to why I'm saying towards an answer at the very end here of the talk. So hypergraphs provide this mathematical model of data for multi-way relationships. We've got vertices and we have hyperedges, and we can ask questions about connectivity of entities. So on the right here, we've got a picture of a hypergraph where the vertices are characters in Les Mis, and the hyperedges indicate whether that group of characters was in a scene together. I believe it's a scene. And you can look at connectivity. So, if this character was not in any scenes with this character down here, but how many hops does it take to get from one character to another? So you can look at clustering and just model these kinds of multi-way interactions. So the technical definition, a hypergraph H has vertices V and a family of edges E. And when I say family, what I mean by that is that each EI is the name, basically, of a hyperedge, which contains a set of vertices. You might have multiple hyperedges that have the same set of vertices, but different names, right? So two papers that are co-authored by the same group would have two hyperedges, or could have two hyperedges, I should say. So a graph is, of course, a hypergraph where all edges have size 2, but in general, we can have edges of any size. We have to also treat special cases like empty edges, multi-edges, I've already mentioned, isolated vertices, so those are vertices that are not in any hyperedge, and redundant vertices. And by redundant, I mean a vertex, a pair of vertices that are in exactly the same set of hyperedges. So those would be redundant vertices. There's many different ways that we can represent a hypergraph. The most common one you'll see in my talk today is this Euler diagram, where the vertices are dots and the hyperedges are rubber bands around the set of vertices in that hyperedge. There's some issues here with planarity. Sometimes you can't physically lay out, just like planar graphs, you can't actually lay out the hypergraph so that you have the right set of edges, or the vertex looks like it's in the right set of edges. But for the most part, all of the pictures that I'll show you today don't have that problem. We can also look at a bipartite diagram where we lay out the vertices on the left and the hyperedges on the right and connect vertices and hyperedges if there's a containment. We can look at the incidence matrix, which has some nice linear algebra properties. We can just look at the sets, and we can look at something called a simplicial diagram, which if you haven't seen simplicial complexes, this will make more sense later. I don't use this very often, but essentially we're laying out, we're calling out which edges of the simplicial complex are actually present in the hypergraph. So for example, AC is not numbered, and therefore it's not an actual hyperedge in the hypergraph. Okay, so since this is a data science seminar, let's talk about what kind of data can generate hypergraphs. I've got 3 examples here. The first one is where we have Boolean attributes, and these are attributes that may not be related to each other, and they also may not indicate specific relationships among the entities that have that attribute. So for example, the fact that John and Sally and Gertie all have brown eyes doesn't necessarily mean that they're related to each other. It just means that they share some property. Joint relationships are one step above that, in where the sort of attribute, or the column here, does indicate some sort of relationship or participating in something together. Here we have some DNS data looking at IPs versus domain names. And lastly, we have numeric data. So if you have just a numeric matrix, rows, columns, numbers, you can turn that into a hypergraph as well. And this case is a biological example that I'll tell you more about later. So in all 3 cases, you can turn your empty and X matrix or array into a 0-1 matrix in the kind of obvious way in the first 2 examples, and on the bottom example, you must do some sort of thresholding or other kind of functional, transformation to turn your numerical data into 0-1 data. And here I've just chosen if it's positive, it's 1, if it's negative or 0, then it's 0. And from there, you generate your hypergraph by turning all your rows into vertices and all of your columns into hyperedges that enclose those vertices that indicated by the 1. And so in this case, the supervisor hyperedge has John and Sally in it, for example. So, I showed you on the prior slide how we turn one of these incidence matrices into a hypergraph, but there's nothing particularly special about the fact that I chose the rows to be vertices and the columns to be hyperedges. I could have transposed my matrix and gotten what's called the dual hypergraph, where in the transpose, again, I let the vertices be the rows and the hyperedges be the columns, but it's the flip in the, so we have the primal and the dual. We also can, again, look at the bipartite representation of the same thing. So here we get both, everything is a vertex in the bipartite representation. And there are other graph approximations that are typically used to study this kind of hypergraph data. The one I'm showing here on the left is called the two-section. It's also sometimes called the underlying graph or the clique expansion. You might have seen those terms before. But all that it's doing is really it's taking the S matrix times S transpose and then subtracting off the diagonal degree matrix here. And I'm missing a weight down here on this AC edge. I think it should be 1. But this is a graph approximation, and you can kind of see the resemblance between the graph, this two-section clique expansion, and the hypergraph. But what we're missing is this information about the fact that this triangle is filled in the hypergraph, and this triangle is not filled in the hypergraph. This is not information that you can get from just the underlying graph. Of course, you can also do S transpose S and then subtract off the diagonal edge size matrix, and you will get the two-section of the dual, which is also known as the line graph of the hypergraph. So here, if you're thinking in the primal case, all of your hyperedges from the primal become vertices in this line graph, and they are connected if there's an intersection between those hyperedges. But it's really just the two-section of the dual of the hypergraph. Okay, so I wanted to point this out because, you know, in pretty much everything else that I'm going to talk about, we're going to stick with the primal. Rows are vertices, columns are hyperedges, but just know that these hypergraphs come in dual pairs in ways that graphs don't. The dual of a graph is frequently a hypergraph, and so we don't talk about graphs coming in dual pairs, but hypergraphs do. So hypergraphs have combinatorial structure, just like graphs do. We can talk about the degree or the degree distribution as the number of hyperedges that each vertex is a part of. We can talk about the edge size or edge size distribution, which is something we can't, or we can talk about it in graphs, but it's really boring because every edge is size 2. But in a hypergraph, edge sizes are something that is interesting, and oftentimes we can get a sense of the structure of the hypergraph, or at least whether the hypergraph is interesting in structure, if the edge size distribution and the degree distribution are both non-trivial. We can also talk about walks, paths, diameters, connected components, centrality, clustering coefficient, triangle counting, a lot of different things that have a wide use in graphs. We can generalize those to hypergraphs, but notice that I have this S parameter in front of all of them. I'll tell you what I mean by that in a slide or two. I'm not going to get to the clustering coefficient of the triangle counting, but you can check out this paper by my colleague Sanan and myself and a few other folks in EPJ data science that goes through a lot of this kind of combinatorial structure. Another thing to point out is that in a graph, you know, we typically think of walks between vertices, but in a hypergraph, it can be a little bit more complicated than that. So let me say what I mean by that. For graphs, if you've got a sequence of vertices, it implies, as long as you don't have a multigraph, it implies a unique sequence of edges. And similarly, if you have a sequence of edges, it implies a unique sequence of vertices. But in a hypergraph, that is not the case. Each pair of vertices might belong to many edges. So here we've got a pair of vertices A and C, and that belong to 2 hyperedges. Similarly, each pair of hyperedges, E1 and E2, for example, can intersect at many vertices. Here we've got 2 vertices, B and C. And so it's not well defined. You can't just say, oh, I have a sequence of vertices, you must know the sequence of edges, and vice versa. You have to define walks in both cases, and they are different. So we have walks between edges as a sequence of successively intersecting edges, and walks between vertices as a sequence of successively adjacent vertices. Our focus in most of our work and in this talk is on the walks between edges because we think that it's more intuitive to define. So let me go ahead and do that. An S-walk is a sequence of edges, E1 through EK, such that the intersection between successive edges is size at least S. So a 1-walk is a typical where every edge must intersect in at least 1 vertex. A 2-walk, they must intersect in at least 2 vertices, and so forth. So that means that walks and paths and hypergraphs, in addition to their length, they also have a width. It's illustrated here. So in a graph, if you think of a hypergraph, if you think of a graph as a hypergraph, this walk from the blue edge to the green edge is a length 2 and width 1, of course, because all edges in graphs intersect at single vertices. But in a hypergraph, here's 2 examples of paths of length 2, but on the left we have our intersection of size 1, and on the right we have our intersection of size at least 3 here and 4 here. And so this allows us to talk about, more strong connectivity, weak connectivity in the hypergraph. So once you have a walk, which we've just defined, you can define a path, a distance, components, and many other things that are based off of walks. So an S path is an S walk where the edges are not repeated. So in this example, I've got a walk that goes 5, 3, 1, 5, 10, 12. Of course, that's a walk, not a path. I have to remove the cycle in there to get it to just be an S path. This is a 1 path because my intersections are size 1. If I require my intersections to be size 2, I have to go a little bit farther. I have to go from 5 to 6 to 10 to 11 to 12 to get from 5 to 12 with intersections of size 2. S distance is then the length of the shortest S path between 2 edges. Diameter, similarly, is the longest S distance in the hypergraph. And then the S component is a collection of edges so that any pair of edges are connected via an S path. So for example, a 3 component is shown down here. Just these 2 edges, the brown and the pink, at the bottom is a 3 component because their intersection is size 4. But everything else, well, actually, there's a kind of a trivial one up here with the purple and the red, 5 and 4, that 4 is contained within 5 and has 3 vertices. A 2 component is a lot larger, but still doesn't include the entire hypergraph, where we have to pick off the cycle over here and this size 2 edge up here. So how can we use these components in an example? Let's talk about a DNS example. So in the DNS use case, we have IP addresses and domains. So the nodes are IPs, the hyperedges are domains. And it turns out the DNS domain name service system is not typically one-to-one. Now, maybe typically is the wrong word. It's not always one-to-one. There are domain aliases. So if you mistype Google, Google's got your back, you'll still go to the right place. But so there might be multiple domains that have the same IP address. And similarly, there's hosting services where multiple IP addresses will have the same domain just for redundancy. There's also random IP reassignment. And so if you look at a long enough time period, you're going to see collisions. There's this interesting data set at Active DNS that I suggest people look at if you're interested in this topic area. It's a very big set of data. And basically they comb the whole internet like every day or multiple times a day and get the IPs and the domains listed. So you can use this to answer questions about looking at maybe abnormal IPs and domains. And then you can also look at things that you know are bad and try to find their neighborhoods. I'm showing 2 interesting components that we found in this Active DNS data. One is this content delivery network, looks like a star. And then the bottom one is something that we think might be fast flux, which is where IPs are shared among a variety of domains very, very quickly to kind of hide malicious activity. We don't know that this is fast flux, just the signature seems like fast flux, but this was a component that had high diameter and abnormally high diameter in our data. So moving on to the next kind of combinatorial property that we can look at, centrality. So a question of, which nodes or edges are close to everything, that would be closeness centrality. In a graph, closeness centrality is defined by taking the 1 over the sum of all of the distances. So for a particular vertex, find the distances to all of the other vertices, add them all up, and then take 1 over that, multiply by the size of the graph. Harmonic closeness centrality gets around the problem where you might have infinite distances if you have multiple components in the graph. So it 1 over infinity is defined to be 0 here, and so you can get rid of that issue. So we've got the reciprocal of the average and the reciprocal of the harmonic mean of the distances for graphs. For hypergraphs, you can do basically the same thing. First, you have to identify all of the edges of size at least s, because we're going to be defining s centrality. And so the closeness centrality, the S closeness centrality is defined exactly the same as in graphs, except I replace my distance with an S distance, and we restrict to all of the edges of size at least S, because otherwise you can't be S distant to something that can't intersect with you, unless if it's smaller than size S. So again, we have the reciprocal of the mean and the reciprocal of the harmonic mean. And this gives us an S centrality for the edges. You can do the same thing for the vertices if you define the walks on the vertices, but again, we're looking at the case of edges. And this is a heat map for S equals 2. Similarly, betweenness centrality can be redefined from a graph to a hypergraph by just saying S path instead of path, or S shortest path in the graph. So you take, for each hyperedge, you look at the pairs of other hyperedges and you ask how many shortest S paths between these G and F is E on, and that's the numerator, and then just how many shortest paths between G and F are there generally, and that's the denominator. Sum that all up and you get your betweenness, your S betweenness centrality. So we used this in a biological use case, which was really interesting. We got this paper in BMC Bioinformatics. If you're interested in this, to get more of the details, what we did is we took a lot of data from many viruses: Ebola, influenza, MERS, SARS, West Nile virus. We started this before COVID was cool, and got into it a little bit more when COVID hit. So these viruses were put into cell lines. The samples were analyzed at various time points, and transcriptomics, or measuring the expression of genes, was measured in these samples. And so what we have in this table is, actually this should say gene instead of protein. This is the log2 of the sample expression divided by the control expression. So this negative number is saying that this gene was downregulated in Ebola wild type at 0 hours, whereas it was upregulated in Ebola wild type at 8 hours, for example. We turn this into a hypergraph by saying that the nodes are the conditions. So I'm violating my one rule that I said earlier. In this case, the nodes are going to be my columns. So I'm taking the flip of this matrix. And the hyperedges are my genes. And there's a containment, there's a condition contained within the gene hyperedge if the z-score, column-wise z-score of that condition is greater than or equal to 2, and a p-value that's separately calculated is significant. So basically, the condition is contained within the gene hyperedge if that gene is significantly modified in that particular sample. Okay. So our goal was to find genes that are central in host response to viral infection. And our hypothesis was that if we use hypernetwork science measures, they're going to rank genes that are known to be central. So we had a ground truth, like immune response, for example. The hypernetwork science measures like centrality are going to rank these known central genes higher than if you do a network science approach in a very well-used graph called the context likelihood of relatedness, or CLR graph, of the same data. So the way that we can measure this hypothesis is we use something called the gene set enrichment analysis, which determines whether members of a known gene set, so the immune response, are in the top rank, bottom rank, or kind of randomly distributed. So for example, if I've got my ranked list, let's say this is genes 1 through N, ranked using S betweenness centrality, and I have a target set of immune genes. If the target set is near the top of the list, I have a high positive GSEA value. If they're near the bottom of the list, I have a low or negative GSEA value. And if they're kind of uniformly distributed, my GSEA is going to be around 0. So with that explanation, this is what we found. The green are the GSEA scores for all of the hypergraph measures. The blue are the GSEA scores for all of the graph measures, and this salmon color is for just taking a very simple not graph, not hypergraph approach. And so we found that the hypergraph really does significantly outperform the graph measures in identifying important genes in the system. So we're hoping to get some more work to apply this in other viruses to explore this a bit more. Okay, another area where we've been working is in hypergraph clustering. So the idea here is to partition the node set into well-connected groups. There's been linear algebraic clustering methods suggested because they work well in graphs, so let's try them in hypergraphs. But the problem is we lack really effective Laplacian representations. Typically, hypergraph Laplacians that exist in the literature are often basically just Laplacians of some of the graph representations that I showed you earlier, the two-section or the line graph. And so you lose the hypergraph properties. But if you have edge-dependent vertex weights, so this is a weight of a vertex that depends on what edge it's in. So the weight of V1 in E1 is 7 versus if V1 is in E2, it's 3. If you have these edge-dependent vertex weights, you can create a Markov chain and then a Laplacian from that, which does not come from a graph Laplacian. And what we found, this is work led by Sinan Aksoy with some collaborators at Georgia Tech, is that when they did hypergraph clustering using, or they did an NMF clustering using the hypergraph Laplacian as input, they found that it did a better job of finding subcategories in the 20 news group data. And they're currently working on some non-uniform hypergraph analyses using tensors and tensor decompositions, which should be really interesting when they get through that topic. So before I move on to the topology portion of the program, I just wanted to mention that everything that I've been talking about so far has been, with I guess the exception of the prior slide, has been in unweighted, undirected, well, we have labels, but unattributed, let's say, hypergraphs. But there's a lot more there that we're trying to get our hands into in the coming year. So for example, directed hypergraphs, there's differences between ordered hyperedge where you say, oh, my hyperedge is A, B, C, but the order of the vertices is it goes from A to B to C. Whereas you can also have a directed hyperedge, which like bisects the vertices to say A, B are the head of my edge and C, D are the tail of the edge. And there's many different ways that you could kind of get a continuum between an ordered hyperedge and a directed hyperedge. So we're going to be exploring some of that this year. And then attributed hypergraphs, where you've got properties on the edges or weights on the edges or vertices, are another thing that we've been exploring in some other projects. But I haven't gotten to them here in this this talk. And we also have limited support for these things currently in our Hypernet software that I'll give you more details on later. So I'm going to move to the next piece, which is the topological properties of hypergraphs. But before I do that, let me just see if there's any questions and take a little water break for myself. Doesn't sound like there's any questions. Okay. So I'll move on to the topological properties of hypergraphs. So first, for those of you that aren't familiar with topology, I need to tell you what it is. Topology is best illustrated for me by this donut turning into a coffee cup. It's geometry without distances. It's stretchy geometry. You can take this coffee cup, if it's made out of rubber or Play-Doh, and transform it into a donut without cutting or gluing or punching holes in it. It's properties that are preserved under continuous deformation. It's also about abstracting an object into a simpler version that preserves certain properties that you care about. And in topology, what you care about are holes, typically. The super early example of topology is in the 7 bridges of Königsberg problem that Euler solved in the 1700s. And the problem, which I'm guessing most or all of you have heard, but let me just tell you briefly, you have this city and you have 7 bridges going from the north bank, the south bank, and 2 different islands. And the question is, can you start in one part of the city, traverse each bridge exactly once, and end where you started? And people were trying to solve this problem, and what Euler said is, hey, it doesn't matter where you start in the city. The north bank is the north bank. It's not like this corner and that corner are different. So let's just say every landmass is a vertex and every bridge is an edge. And now I have a much simpler problem. I don't have to worry about where I'm walking on each of the landmasses. I just have to go from one to the other. And in simplifying the problem, he was able to solve it in the general case rather than just in this one city. So that's the basics of topology of abstracting objects. Let me tell you about the couple of tools that we will be using here in algebraic topology. So we use abstract algebra, to study topological spaces. The 2 main concepts that I will mention here are simplicial complex and homology. Homotopy is another thing that's interesting, but I won't talk about it. So in an abstract simplicial complex, you have a set X and a collection of subsets. So it sounds a lot like a hypergraph already, right? But it has a particular property that if I have a subset tau, and sigma is a subset of tau, then sigma also has to be in my abstract simplicial complex. So I've got 3 examples here of geometric realizations. On the left, I have all of these vertices are sets, all of the pairwise edges that are indicated are sets, all of these triangles that are colored here are sets, and then the tetrahedra itself, a 4-vertex set, is also contained in my simplicial complex. On the right, everything that's on the left except for the 4-vertex subset. So my tetrahedra is now hollow. And on the bottom, I'm missing, every time I give this, I need to remember to put the dots here. There should be dots indicating the vertices of this triangle. But now I have 2 components. Notice that I've got a loop in either of A and B, and in B, I've got a hollow zone that is enclosed by a surface where I don't have that in A. Homology is taking an algebraic representation of the topological structure, meaning the whole structure, not HOLE, not WHOLE. The intuition is that the homology provides a way to represent algebraically and then count the holes in different dimensions. So the dimensional count, for dimension 1, we have 1 hole in both of A and B. That's this loop here in both of them. We have, and in dimension 2, we have 1 hole in B, but nothing in A or C. That's, again, this hollow tetrahedra. So the dimension is saying, what's the dimension of the surface that's enclosing the hole? In dimension 0, we say that a hole is a connected component. So in A and B, we have a single connected component. In C, we have 2 connected components. So that's where we get the dimension 2 for C. Now, these Betti numbers are the dimensions of homology groups, which if you're familiar with abstract algebra, this may make sense to you. If not, you don't need to know it for the rest of the talk. But we have these groups that basically tell you what the holes are, and then the dimensions are doing the counting. So we've got, if you're doing homology over Z, then you have just 1 copy of Z in dimension 0 for A and B, and 2 copies for C. Okay, so that's the introduction to algebraic topology that you need to know for at least this talk. So what do we mean by topology for hypergraphs? Because a hypergraph is not a simplicial complex, but we can turn it into one, right? We can say, okay, well, here's my hypergraph. I'm going to add all of the subedges that I need to turn this hypergraph into a simplicial complex. And then I can compute homology of my simplicial complex that came from the hypergraph. But this adds information, and it's unclear whether adding that information is destroying some kind of structure that you had in the hypergraph itself. So there are more complex ways of making simplicial complexes or topological spaces from the hypergraph. Ideally, we do it without adding or removing information, but it's we haven't found one yet that is just a complete translation, a direct translation without removing or adding some information. So I don't think I'll have time to talk in detail about each of these, although I can if we have time at the very end and you're interested. But if I have a hypergraph here shown where I've got AB as an edge, BC as an edge, and A as an edge on its own, we've developed something called the restricted barycentric subdivision, which builds a simplicial complex from the hypergraph by looking at the edges that are present in the barycentric subdivision of the simplicial complex. We have developed another theory called the relative barycentric subdivision, which is a relative homology, basically looking at a quotient group instead of just the homology groups themselves. And there's other finite topological spaces that one can build from hypergraphs, and then look at simplicial complexes that are directly from those finite topological spaces. But the question is, what properties do each of these topological interpretations capture? Because if we don't know what we want to capture, or we don't know what they capture, then what's the point, right? So let me give you a quick example of finding a topological hole in a real hypergraph. Again, going back to the DNS example, we've got 3 hypergraphs here from active DNS. And it turns out, you can see this one-dimensional hole in DNS1 pretty clearly, but DNS2 also has a one-dimensional hole, and I don't know where it is. It's somewhere buried in here. DNS3 apparently has 3 one-dimensional cycles somewhere in this mess, and DNS2 has 2 hollow tetrahedra somewhere again in here, and we've done some PowerPoint magic to show you where one of the holes in DNS2 is. It's here in this Pottery Barn Teen, West Elm, and West Elm Home nexus, but showing that there's this empty space in this bit here, which maybe indicates that in the future, if you'd collect more data, there's going to be another website in the Pottery Barn family that would use all 4 of these IP addresses, perhaps. Okay, let's see. So I asked a question a couple of slides ago about, what properties are these different homology theories or topological spaces built from hypergraphs capturing, and if we don't know what we want to capture and how we can capture that, then we need to do that work. So here's a follow-up question, for that is what actually do we want to capture using homology from a hypergraph? And if the one potential answer is the structure of the interactions among the hyperedges. So in order to capture that, we can build something called the nerve, or the nerve complex. So for each hyperedge, we create a vertex. This maybe will sound familiar to you from something earlier. For each hyperedge, we can create a vertex, and there's a simplex in my nerve that connects a set of vertices, again, corresponding to hyperedges, if the intersection of that set of vertices is non-empty. In this case, all of my intersections are pairwise. I don't have any 3-way intersections in this hypergraph, and so I get a graph as my simplicial complex, but in general, you can get arbitrary simplicial complexes. So that's one thing we could build, a simplicial complex that we could build from the graph and then look at the homology of that, right? That's not really losing, well, it's losing some information. But my claim, and I've proved this elsewhere, so I should probably say proposition or something, is that actually, the nerve of the hypergraph is equal to, it's exactly the same as the simplicial complex of the dual. So here's my hypergraph, here's its nerve. If I take the dual hypergraph and take the simplicial complex of that, I get exactly the same thing, exactly the same structure. And there's another theorem called the Dowker duality that tells me that these 2 closures, or these 2 nerves, are homotopy equivalent, meaning that they're going to have the same homology. And so if the answer to my question about what is it about the hypergraph that we want to capture, if the answer is the structure of the interactions among the hyperedges, then it's enough to just compute the homology of the simplicial complex of that hypergraph. We don't have to do anything more fancy than that. But your answer might not be the structure of interactions among the hypergraph. It might be, or the hyperedges, it might be something else that requires a more complicated object to be computed or constructed from your hypergraph. So in the interest of time, I'm going to skip the next couple slides of details and just summarize topological characterization of hypergraphs. Again, I can give you more information at the end if there are questions. But the simple interpretation of homology of a hypergraph is that it's the closure of this. Take the simplicial complex closure and the homology of that. But there are other ways of doing it. There's not a canonical interpretation necessarily. You have to think about what hypergraph properties you want to capture. We talked about the nerve simplicial complex, again, where there's a couple of others that we've developed in relative barycentric and restricted barycentric subdivision. There's other finite topological spaces. There are things called chain complexes that you can compute homology from directly that don't require a topological space. That you can also, that's called embedded homology by some other researchers. And what is the data science application of all of this? Thinking back to the DNS example, is this notion of holes as hypotheses. So a hole might indicate missing data or opportunity for more data collection or more research to kind of fill in the information. And that's where we are looking to apply the homology, is to try to identify, what do these holes tell us about my data set. So a quick commercial for our HyperNetX software. This is a Python package modeled initially on the NetworkX Python package for graph or network science. We have visualization, analysis. We have a lot of hypernetwork science methods. We have topological. You can compute the homology of the simplicial complex associated with the hypergraph using HNX. We have a new version, 1.1.3 is out with a really cool visualization, interactive visualization widget where you can drag the vertices around, you can group them, you can do all sorts of fun stuff. And if you have used HNX before and haven't updated to 1.1, I highly recommend that you do that, because it does give you something called a static data structure, which makes it a lot more performant for large hypergraphs. We have some C++ optimizations as well using the Northwest Hypergraph package. And before I get to questions, I'm going to just do this teaser on modeling additional complexity in data. So so far, what I've told you about in hypergraphs really have two dimensions, right? We have authors and papers, or genes and samples, or IPs and domains, right? We've got these two things that we want to model together. But data is a lot more complex even than that. Many real-world data sets have structure of, cybersecurity. We've got domains and IPs, but we also have MAC addresses. We have malware. We've got all sorts of things that we might want to associate to either domains or IPs or both. In biology, we have proteins and pathways and complexes and all sorts of things. In Harry Potter, we have many dimensions to each person as well. And so here's in the cybersecurity example, we have our domains versus IPs. Great. We can create a graph of just the IPs against each other, right? Connected pairwise. If there's a domain in common, we can do the same thing with the domains. We can build the hypergraph of domains versus IPs, or the dual of IPs versus domains. But if you've got multiple dimensions, is a hypergraph model even appropriate anymore? What's the generalization for more than pairs? One thing we've been or a couple of options we've been thinking about is pivoting amongst pairs of dimensions. So you can build the domain IP hypergraph, pivot then to the IP service hypergraph, pivot then to the service malware hypergraph, and so forth. You could build your hypergraph on domains versus IPs and then have properties hanging off of the vertices and edges based off of the malware or service that might be associated. You can do some sort of nesting or recursive hypergraph structure of hypergraphs contained within hypergraphs. But all of those are still kind of using a hypergraph as the model. What if there's something more that's needed? Let me talk about a case where the table is complete, for example. So here, what I mean by complete is every row is filled. every row has a house, a blood status, a species, a hair color, an eye color. And so we could represent this as a tensor. Here's just a three-dimensional version of blood status, house by species, and then in each entry, we can count the number of rows that have that combination, right? You can do an n-dimensional tensor that does this. So if a graph models a self-relation, a hypergraph models a binary relation, a tensor can model one of these multi-way relations. But I lied a little bit when I said every row is filled because we have unknowns in here. How do you represent unknowns? You could represent it as just another row or column that's called unknown, but is that really what you want? And then another question about this tensor representation is it a generalization of a hypergraph? What is the network structure of a tensor? When you go from graphs to hypergraphs, you keep the notions of vertices, edges, walks. But when you go to a tensor, it's not clear to me yet what is the network structure of that tensor. That's when the data is complete. What if you only have subrelations? So here's an example in bibliometrics. We have a paper, author, keyword, tuple, right? Every paper has a set of authors and a set of keywords. So great. So we can take a single paper and then for each author and each keyword make a tuple, paper, author, keyword. Great. Every author also has probably a department of some sort, perhaps many departments, making it a legitimate hypergraph. Every author or some authors have won awards in their professional society, for example, perhaps many awards. But there isn't a database that gives us paper, author, keyword, department, award. There's not a way, the award isn't associated to the paper. It's only associated to the author. It's not associated to the keyword either. And so you don't have this full, complete tensor. What you have are multiple tensors with links between dimensions. And this is a standard kind of database format with primary keys, data columns, foreign keys, and so forth. I've got an example here. But how do you model this? You don't necessarily have a single tensor. And I'm going to throw this out there. And I've seen some work by David Spivak on categorical databases where maybe the answer lies in category theory. The way that the tables link together resembles a category diagram, and the data then are populated via a functor from this category diagram to the category set. Now this is way out there. We haven't really fully dove into this yet, but there's other evidence to me that category theory might be lurking in here, in that there is a category of hypergraphs, and the way that category is defined on a particular type of a diagram, where I'm thinking maybe we could generalize that diagram to something that's more complex than what is used for hypergraphs and get a category for these kinds of complex interrelated tensors. Maybe a category of relation, maybe a category of tensors is what's going to be the answer. I don't know, but if you're interested in this or have some thoughts on this, please reach out. This is an area that we're really looking to dive into this year. So before I give you my contact information and email, let me just kind of summarize here. Graphs have been a foundation for a long time in network science, and they're very useful. We get a lot of information out of graphs. But when you have more than two interacting elements, you may have to move into the hypergraph realm. When you have multiple dimensions, then you may have to work into the tensor realm. And then going up from there, hypergraphs generalize into simplicial complexes, generalize into topological spaces. And we've also done some work in topological sheaves where we have weights and things layered on top of our topological spaces. So this is a kind of a full hierarchy of the work that we've been doing. And another commercial for us, if you have interest in these topics, we're running a AMS mathematics research community next summer. On graphs and hypergraphs. We may get into the topology stuff. There's more information here, ams.org. If you just search for AMS MRC, look for the 2022 programs. Ours is called HyperNet. We are open, we're accepting applications right now, open to people that are, I think it's plus or minus 2 or 3 years from their PhD. So if that's you and you're interested in this stuff, the MRC is a fantastic program. I went through one, which is where I actually learned about computational topology back in 2012. And so I wouldn't have been giving this talk to you today if not for an MRC program that I did almost a decade ago. Wow. It gets you a big network of collaborators and into a research area in a very friendly way. So that's my commercial for that. I'll leave you here with my contact information, and I think I've got 4 or 5 minutes if there's any questions.
Great, thanks, Emilie. That was an excellent talk. If there are any questions for Emilie, you can feel free to unmute yourself, or if you prefer, you can type those questions in the chat, and I can read those. To get us started, I do have a question for you, Emilie.
Sure.
In network science, I've seen that there's some standard models that people often use with graphs, like the Watt-Strogatz or the Erdős-Renyi. I'm wondering, in hypergraph land, are there sort of standard models of study that people turn to when first thinking about a new concept?
Yeah, that's a really good question. So standard models, I don't know off the top of my head if like the general literature has those kinds of standard models, but we have worked internally with generalizations of Erdős-Renyi and Chung-Lu and the beater model to generalize to hypergraphs. I think we're working on getting those into the HyperNetX package, but typically, or I believe they work on the bipartite graph for the most part. So if you build, a random Erdős-Renyi bipartite graph, that will give you a random hypergraph. Similarly, with a Chung-Lu bipartite or a beater bipartite, you can then get a hypergraph from that. Things like preferential attachment or Watt-Strogatz, I don't know if there are analogs, but that actually might be one of the topics that we cover in our MRC as a research question. So if they don't exist yet and you're interested in that, maybe we'll be working on that next year.
Great, thanks. Are there any other questions for Emilie? We've got a couple more minutes here.
I have a question.
Mm-hmm.
So you talked about the difference between hypergraphs and simplicial complexes, and
Yep.
that you lose data when you're using simplicial complex, and you result in only looking at the structure. So I might have missed, but do you usually use hypergraphs rather than simplicial complexes, or do you use both, or did you observe the difference in actual applications?
Yeah, so we use hypergraphs usually, unless we're doing something topological, which requires you move into a simplicial complex of some sort, or
I
a
see.
topological space, I should say. So we typically, because the reason that we use the hypergraph rather than the simplicial complex, well, there's a couple reasons. One is data size. The hypergraph typically has some big hyperedges. If you've got a hyperedge of size 100 or 1,000, the simplicial complex is just gigantic, right? Because you need all of the
Right.
subsets of that.
I see.
And the other reason is that it's just more faithful to the data. So if you've got a pair of protein complexes that intersect at 3 proteins, it's important to know whether those 3 proteins on their own would do anything,
I see.
or whether those 3 proteins result in nothing unless they're in the presence of their friends.
I see.
So yeah.
Yeah. Thank you.
Does that answer your question?
Yes. Thanks.
Okay. And I do see one in the chat. Can you comment on work related to learning hypergraphs from data, likelihoods of hyperedges and graphs? I can't specifically comment on this yet because we haven't done this work, but I believe I would expect that, again, going through the bipartite graph could allow you to apply some of the typical graph, link prediction, likelihood work, as long as you require that bipartiteness property. But I do know that we are interested in hypergraph learning in the coming couple of years. I think have some projects that may be working on that. So stay tuned, I guess, is my answer for that. And a question about getting my slides. These are released through PNNL, so I can Sarah, I'll send you a different PDF because the PDF had a couple of extra slides that I didn't go through. So I'll create a new one. I'll send it to you, and you can either reach out to me or to Sarah to get the slides.
Yeah, we have an internal Confluence page for this seminar series.
Oh, great.
We'll post those there, then our participants can access it there.
Great.
But yeah, it looks like we're out of time. This was an excellent talk, Emilie. We were very grateful for your time today to come discuss with us. And it sounds like Emilie's pretty open to having further conversation. If any of you would like to continue the conversation with her, you can reach her there with her contact information. So yeah, thank you. Next month, we're going to be hosting Knighton from UC Davis, and he's going to talk to us on his work in machine learning and food safety. So I hope that you can join us next month if that is a topic that piques your interest. Thanks, Emilie, and goodbye, everybody.